getting my history on. Howdy y'all, Jaybird here, and welcome to 4x4 Today. Today I took the excursion ride at the Dixie Run, and it was fabulous. We learned a whole bunch of history about Oak Ridge and everything that went on. I recorded just a little bit of it, so it's long, it's good. Pay attention, and I'll see you on the trails.
Now, the Lord knew that President Roosevelt wouldn't know who he was. So he got Albert Einstein to sign the letter. He knew Roosevelt would know who he was. So they gave it to Alexander Sachs. Alexander Sachs was a personal friend of President Roosevelt. And he arranged for a meeting. He wrote a little summary. I just learned a few months ago from Dick Groves, who was General Groves' grandson, that President Roosevelt never read the letter. Alexander Sachs had written a paragraph, an executive summary, and put it on top of the letter. President Roosevelt read the note and said, "What you're trying to tell me is that Germany is going to build a bomb, a new big bomb, and we need to do it first." He said, "That's right, that's what we need to do." So that started the Manhattan Project. Now they put General Groves in charge of the Manhattan Project. Groves had just finished building the Pentagon, so he knew how to put a large construction project together. He knew how to get private industry involved, and he knew how to spend money. So President Roosevelt also called in Senator McKellar, and he said, "Senator, I need to put a large amount of money against the war effort, and I can't let the press or anyone know how much it is or what it's being used for. Can you help me with that?" Senator McKellar said, "Yes, Mr. President, I can do that for you. Just where in Tennessee are you going to put that thing?" Yeah, that might have more to do with us getting selected in East Tennessee than any ridges and valleys, rivers, and proximity to a dam. I had the opportunity to interview Senator Howard Baker before he passed away, and we set a television camera up in his office up in Scott County and said, "Okay, Senator, tell us about your connection to Oak Ridge." He said, "First, let me tell you how that place was chosen." He went into that Senator McKellar story in the most flamboyant way you've ever heard. When he got through, I said to him, "Thank you, Senator, for putting on video the story that I tell everyone who comes to Oak Ridge." He said, "Where did you get that story?" I said, "I got it from Dick Smizer, longtime editor of the local newspaper there, the Oak Ridge." He said, "That's where I got it too." I'm going to tell you another Senator McKellar story, and I know this one's true, because the man that it happened to just died within the last couple of years. His name is Lester Fox. He's a patriarch of the Fox Automobile dealership in this area. But in 1942, he was a sophomore in high school at Oliver Springs, where we just lived, and we're just north of Oak Ridge. He was skipping school. Him and his buddy were playing the pinball machine. When they got through, they were walking down the main street of the little town. They walked by the telephone office. The telephone operator leaned her head out and said, "Lester, go get the principal. He's got an important phone call." Now, Lester's skipping school. What he does, he goes and gets the principal. Principal comes over and takes the phone call, comes back to the school, calls all the students together in an assembly, and says, "I've just gotten a phone call from Senator McKellar. He wants me to tell you to go home and tell your parents you're going to have to find another place to live. The government's going to take your property for the war effort." Now Lester swears that's the way these 3,000 people first learned they were going to have to get off of 60,000 acres in order to make room for the Manhattan Project. Many of them didn't have automobiles, they didn't have trucks to move their belongings. They had a car, they might not be able to buy gas for it or tires. Those things were rationed. But what they did have was young men in the military getting killed. So they wanted to do anything they could to stop that killing and end the war. So they got off their property, many of them in a matter of days, in order to make room for the Manhattan Project. One of those families that had to leave in 1942 was descended from a man named John Hendricks. Now, John was born in 1865, Civil War time, in Bear Creek Valley, right where Y-12 is today. In 1900, his youngest daughter died. His wife accused him of being the reason because he corrected her the day before. So she got mad and left him, took the rest of the children, went to Arkansas, and never came back. This really upset John, so he prayed to God, wanting to know why this is happening to him. Heard a loud voice during one of those prayers that said, if you'll go sleep on the ground for 40 nights, you'll learn the future of this place. Now, it must have been in the wintertime, because as the story goes, his hair froze to the ground. Now, let me interrupt my story to tell you, these little communities that were here, we just passed by Wheat on the way coming out. When we turned off of Blair Road and headed down the turnpike, we were going right through the middle of what used to be Wheat. And then Robertsville is right up there when we were at the intersection of Illinois Avenue and the turnpike. Robertsville is just to the northwest, in that northwest section. And then there was the New Hope community, which is out where Y-12 is today, and the Scarborough community, which is just a little further south. Now, some of those still have annual reunions every year. A few years ago, I was speaking at one of those reunions, and I was telling the story about John Henry. I got to the part about his hair freezing to the ground. This little lady held her hand up out in the audience. I said, yes, ma'am. She said, my grandmother put a quilt on John Hendricks when he was sleeping on the ground and fed him chicken soup because he was about to freeze to death. Now, you keep that in mind while I finish telling my story. When John got through sleeping on the ground, he had tremendous stories to tell. He'd tell anyone that would listen. He'd tell them there's going to be a huge factory built in Bear Creek Valley that'll help win the greatest war there'll ever be. There'll be a city built on Black Oak Ridge. Going to be a railroad spur run right down by his property line. And the seat of power for all this is going to be between Pike's Place and Tadlock's Farm. Now, John died in 1915. In 1942, when the Manhattan Project came in here, the first shovel full of dirt they dug was right between Pike's Place and Tadlock's Farm. That's where they put the administration building. That's where the federal office building is today. That city on Black Oak Ridge is called Oak Ridge. That railroad spur runs right down by his property line in Hendricks Creek subdivision, named for John Hendricks. And Y-12 is in Bear Creek Valley, where the uranium for Little Boy was obtained that did help win World War II. Now, I put this story about John Hendricks on my website, and I've been contacted by a lot of people that are descended from John Hendricks. And the ones out in Arkansas, they're just glad to have somebody that has a legend like that attached to their name. And so the ones here in Tennessee, they know the legend. So they tell me other things that he's prophesied, like cargo to be transported through the air. And he said that before there were any airplanes. And then his granddaughter told me that he said they were going to, when they built that little right-of-way for that railroad, they're going to split a tree. And she said for years, they kept a little hash stump painted white right by that railroad track. So, I don't know what you think about those kind of stories, but it gets you thinking about what was here and what the people were like before. Did I give you one? Yeah. Before the Manhattan Project. What questions do you have? I'd much rather answer questions than talk. I can talk for hours, you know that. But I'd love to answer any questions you have. Let me tell you, on the back of this card that I've just given you, there's a link to videos. That's about 12 documentary films that I've made that are out there online. Right before I retired from Y-12, I put them online because I knew when I retired, I'd lose control of them. So they're out there where anybody can get to them. One I highly recommend is called The Oak Ridge Story, The War Years. And I believe that's about the best history of Oak Ridge during the Manhattan Project you're going to find anywhere. And then there's another series of 4 30-minute episodes that we made for public television that tells the history of Y-12. It's called A Nuclear Family. So if you have trouble sleeping one night, put on one of these documentaries and put you to sleep right away. What questions do you have about the Manhattan Project? I know you've got some. Ask me.
Oh, I got all kinds. Well, first, why Manhattan?
Good.
Obviously, Manhattan has nothing to do with Tennessee or Oak Ridge.
That's right. Absolutely not. When they started the project, they gave it to the Army Corps of Engineers, and they gave it to the Manhattan District in New York City. So when they changed it to a project, they just took the Manhattan and named it a project. So the Manhattan comes from New York City.
And speaking of names, you've got Y and K and all that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. X10, Y12, K25, and S50. In 1950, a man by the name of George Robinson wrote a book. The name of the book is The Oak Ridge Story. And he wrote a letter to General Groves. He said, General, I'm writing a book about the history of Oak Ridge, and I need to know where those code names came from for the government facilities and what they mean. General Groves wrote him back and he said, for the life of me, I can't remember where we came up with those codes, but they don't mean anything. Now, the exception to that is K25. The K might stand for the Kellogg's company that made the gaseous diffusion equipment, and the 25 was known to be a shortcut name for uranium-235. They took the 2 off the right-hand side of 92, the atomic number for uranium, and they took the 5 off the right-hand side of 235, the isotopic number. They called it 25. They did the same thing with plutonium. They took the 4 off the right-hand side of 94, the atomic number, and the 9 off of the 239, which was the isotopic number. Now there's a guy that's written a book, Plutonium, the world's most dangerous material. On the front cover of his book, he has a huge watermark of a 4 and a 9. So he knows the story. But Y-12 is now the Y-12 National Security Complex, our nuclear weapons plant, all of the nation's nuclear weapons, all of the highly enriched uranium, the lithium and the tritium for all of our nation's weapons were put together at Y-12. We built over 30,000 of them during the Cold War. And we're coming down to about, by the START treaty, we're supposed to get down to 1,550. We have about 2,000 now, nuclear weapons still armed and ready to go. And the X10 was the graphite reactor, which is now the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. And then, of course, K25 is where we are today. It was the gaseous diffusion plant. The place is now known as the East Tennessee Technology Parks Heritage Center, and it's an industrial park that has about 20 companies already located on the park. It's one where Kairos Power is building the first small modular reactor that it'll be probably online in 26. But codes didn't really mean anything at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Army Corps of Engineers oversee the whole project.
Yes, the Army Corps of Engineers had Oak Ridge, Los Alamos, New Mexico, and Hanford, Washington. Colonel Nichols actually ran the day-to-day activities from here in Oak Ridge. Oppenheimer only had the scientists out at Los Alamos. Nichols had responsibility for the Corps of Engineers portion of Los Alamos, Hanford, and he built the city of Oak Ridge. We're going to build a statue for him and put it up in Oak Ridge, and it's going to be 3D printed by the Oak Ridge High School.
Did they have multiple general contractors under the...
They did. They had Stone and Webster built the Y-12 plant. J.A. Jones built K-25. DuPont built X-10. So Groves was hiring these contractors to do all the work. Just like Department of Energy today, they don't do anything. They hire contractors to do it. And right now, CNS Y-12 runs Y-12, and UT Battelle
runs the Oak Ridge National Laboratory for the Department of Energy.
Well, how did they keep it a secret?
It wasn't easy. You know, there was a spy at Los Alamos called, his name was Klaus Fuchs, and he gave the plans of Fat Man to Russia before we ever used it. Oak Ridge had its spy too. The name of the man that was here is George Kobel, K-O-B-A-L. And I'm convinced that he told Stalin how hard it was to get uranium-235. And Klaus Fuchs gave him the plans to Fat Man, which is a plutonium bomb. And that's why Russia just recreated Fat Man and created their first atomic bomb. Now, George Kobel, there's a book about him that Ann Hagedorn wrote. She came to Oak Ridge, I gave her a tour, and we talked about George Kobel, and she did a whole lot of good research. The name of the book is The Sleeper Agents, and it's about the Oak Ridge spy, George Kobel. Now, after the war ended, they started a club here called the 43 Club. And it was for people who had been here in 1943. At their second meeting, a man held his hand up at the end, near the end of the meeting, and said, "I want to ask a question." He said, "I was required to keep a stack of 3 by 5 cards in my pocket. And if I heard anybody talking about the project, I had to write down what I heard, where I heard it, and who said it. And I had to put it in an envelope and send it to the Acme Finance Company. Now, if I didn't hear anything at the end of the week on Friday, I was supposed to send a blank card in to the Acme Finance Company." I wonder if anybody else had to do that. About half the people in the room held their hand up. So they were spying on one another. And if anybody talked about the project, they got turned in, and oh, by the way, they got escorted off the site, and they weren't allowed to come back. So, yeah, that's how they kept the secret, as best we did. Other questions?
What about infrastructure, infirmaries, grocery stores, schools?
Yeah,
I mean, all that had to be built for that sort of huge amount of people.
it absolutely did. 75,000 people were living in Oak Ridge in August of 1945. So they built a town. It was operating 24 hours a day, around the clock. They had farms here around the area that were raising cattle for the beef. They had chickens, they had hogs, pigs. I mean, they did everything they could to get food for these people. 75,000 people, 5th largest city in the state of Tennessee, and it wasn't on any map. Okay, but the Army Corps of Engineers hired a company to run the town, the Rowan Anderson Company, and they managed all of the issues that you're talking about to get enough food here, get enough houses here. They started out thinking they were building a town for 13,000 people. Eventually, they built a town for 75,000 people, had the 9th largest bus system in the nation, and we're drawing 80,000 people in to work every day. So it was amazing.
And completely secret. And when did the East Tennesseans find out about Oak Ridge? And then they were amazed.
That was on August the 6th, when the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. They had a news release ready to go. Now, they had it ready to go days before. Remember, we're spoiled. We've got instant information now. That didn't happen back in 1945. They had to give newspapers all across the nation information days in advance so they could put it in their presses and they could print papers. And on the same day that we dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, news went out all across the nation that had happened. I talked to one of the Calutron girls, the young ladies that were working at Y12, Ruth Huddleston. And I said, "Ruth, what did you think you were doing when you were working at Y12? She said, "I didn't know. I didn't have any idea. I was just doing something to help win the war." I said, "Well, when you found out what you were doing, what did you think then?" She said, "Well, I was working on that day when the bomb was dropped, and our supervisor told us that we had made the uranium that went in that bomb. And she said, I was glad because I thought this is going to end the war. And my boyfriend is in Germany, already told me he's headed to Japan. So I've saved his life. And then she said, I got home that night and I heard on the radio and read in the paper about how many people we killed. And she said, I got so depressed I couldn't sleep for a week. So that's the kind of thing that was going on here. People did not know what they were doing. 22,482 people working at Y12. Maybe 100 of them, the chemists, would have known they were working with uranium. They wouldn't even thought about it being for a bomb. They would have just thought they're working with this heavy metal for some reason, not knowing what. It's an amazing story.
You said Roan Anderson?
Roan Anderson Company, yeah.
So I think that's where Roan and Anderson County actually came from?
Well, no, they were the counties
Okay.
back in the 1800s, but that they named the country or the company because Oak Ridge sits straddle of the Roan and Anderson County line, so they just named it the Roan Anderson Company. Other questions?
Ray, you worked around this area for a long time. How about working around radiation and stuff like that?
Yeah, I tell people I worked at Y12 for 47 years. It won't hurt you. You can hold highly enriched uranium in your hand. It doesn't give off a lot of radiation, just a little bit of alpha, which will be stopped by a piece of paper or by your skin. Now, you don't want to eat it, nor do you want to inhale it, because anything that has any radioactivity gets inside your body is going to do damage, even that alpha. So, not so with plutonium. Plutonium gives off radiation and you can't handle it. You have to handle it through remote glove boxes and in remote approaches. You don't touch plutonium.
Ray, would you mind going into about the pack up and head to our next stop? Do you mind kind of giving a little detail on that?
On the K-25, what we're going to see is the viewing platform that was built by the contractor, by the Department of Energy, that lets you see the actual footprint of the K-25 building. K-25 building was a mile long from one end of the U around to the other end of the U. It had 3,000 stages of gaseous diffusion. Now, gaseous diffusion, let me tell you the two processes that were used here primarily. The calutrons over at Y12 was a batch process. And the way that worked is you have uranium chloride that you put in between two large magnets. The magnets will cause it to bend, one ion at a time. U-238 is 3 neutrons heavier than U-235. So when it goes into those magnets, centrifugal force will make the 238 make a slightly larger arc than the 235. So you can catch the 235 up to the top. The only problem is in 1,000 pounds of uranium ore, there's only 7 pounds of uranium-235. But you can do that. Batch processes, 1,152 batch processes at Y12. Over at K-25, the gaseous diffusion process takes the material and pumps it 3,000 times now in series through a barrier material that in the space the size of my thumbnail, there are 1 million holes, all the same size, equally spaced. And that 238 and 235 coming through those holes, the 235 will go through a little faster, just a little easier than the 238. So if you do that 3,000 times, you're going to begin to build up a higher percentage of 235. By December of 1946, the K-25 process could produce weapons-grade uranium, high 90% uranium-235. So they shut down Y12 and continued to use K-25. You could operate it for a tenth the cost. It's continuous operation versus a batch process. Now, all of the highly enriched uranium in the nation today came out of the K-25 building. It operated from 1945 until 1964. We've not created any more highly enriched uranium for weapons since 1964. Now, we provide fuel for the Navy's submarines and ships. They use highly enriched uranium, weapons grade. We provide that from Y-12, from the stockpile. We have all of the nation's highly enriched uranium that's not in a nuclear weapon, a research reactor, or in the Navy's ships. All of that is stored at Y-12 in the highly enriched uranium materials facility. But what you're going to see today is the footprint of the K-25 building, which was the largest building under one roof at the time it was constructed. And it was demolished, shut down in '64, torn down in 20, I think we finished it in 2010. All of the rest of the buildings, they also built K-27, 29, 31, and 33 for gaseous diffusion at Y-12. They operated until 1987. So what you're going to see is the footprint of the original building that was the K-25 gaseous diffusion.
And that part of the interpretive center and everything?
Yeah, it's at the William J. Wilcox K-25 Interpretive Center, named for the first historian for the city of Oak Ridge. And I'm proud to say that Gordon Fee and myself made that recommendation, and the Department of Energy accepted it. So we were glad to recognize Bill. You'll see his picture when we go over there, and we'll talk a little more about it when we're there.
Okay, so what we'll do, go ahead and pack up.